I'm going to tell you a really interesting story that most people don't know about. It is the first war between European powers in North America, and it was over Florida. 60 years before the Mayflower brought the pilgrims to America, France made a serious effort to create their own colony in America. It's an important moment that changed the course of American history. Had it gone a different way, America and the world would look different today. Yet nobody knows about it. We're in the middle of the 1500s. It's been over half a century since Columbus's voyages. Spain is the great power. A big reason why they are a great power is because of all of the gold that they are getting from the New World. Their colonies in modern-day Mexico and Peru were generating literal boatloads of money. Something like 20% of the Spanish government's budget came from these treasure ships that would sail from the New World to the mainland. Spain used all that gold to field armies all over Europe. It's the age of Reformation, and Catholic Spain is fighting the Protestants. They had armies everywhere, in Italy, in Germany, in the Netherlands. It may seem bizarre to us today, but at that time, the level of hatred between Catholics and Protestants was off the charts. I mean, people just felt like they could kill others because they believed they were heretics. The Spanish were among the most zealous, and in many respects, they were the swords of Catholicism. Other countries looked at Spain with envy, including the French. They wanted some of that New World wealth to come their way. But France had an additional motivation. They were a Catholic country, but they had a sizable Protestant minority called the Huguenots. Yeah, the French don't pronounce like half their letters. Some of the Huguenots wanted to create a safe haven for themselves in the New World. It was actually similar in a lot of ways to what the Pilgrims wanted 60 years later. So these two motivations, money and land, were pushing the French towards creating a colony, and by the 1560s, they were in a position to pursue that. The big question was where it should be. They needed to be mindful of what the Spanish were doing. Spain claimed all of the New World except for Brazil. Now, just because they claimed all this doesn't mean that they actually controlled all of it. The Spanish had firm control over Peru and Mexico, the places where the gold was, and they had pretty solid control over the Caribbean islands to facilitate that gold coming back to Europe. But in what is today the United States, they didn't have any settlements at all. Now, this doesn't mean that the Spanish didn't see the value of controlling some of this land. If you look at a map, you can see that Florida juts down towards the Caribbean, and controlling that would help secure those really valuable treasure fleets sailing back to Europe. The problem is that the Spanish couldn't find people who wanted to live in Florida. Florida is hot. It is filled with swamps. It's got freaky insects. There's alligators roaming around. It occasionally gets hit by really nasty storms. Plus, there are people already living in Florida who weren't thrilled about outsiders coming in. None of that would have mattered if Florida had valuable things in it. If it had gold, it had silver, it had furs. But it didn't. So the only reason to create a colony in Florida was because of its location. For the French, though, Florida's location made it a great place to start a colony. The reason is that Florida is the perfect place to raid those boatloads of gold sailing back and forth to Europe. They would have had no problem recruiting colonists. France's, hey, move to La Floride so you can become rich, is a much better pitch than Spain's, hey, move to La Florida so the king's domains can become marginally more secure. For these reasons, Florida was chosen as the location of France's New World colony. Now let's introduce the first character in our story, a Frenchman named Jean Ribault. Ribault was a skilled navigator. He was also an Huguenot. So he was totally on board with this colonization thing and was chosen to lead the first expedition. In 1562, Ribault led a group of colonists to America. They explored the area around what is today Jacksonville, Florida, and then headed up the coast. They stumbled upon this island just off of South Carolina, and Ribault decided that this would be a great place to build a colony. It actually was a good place to build a colony. It was easy to defend, it had a nice harbor, and I feel like it was the right amount of distance from the Spanish. Close enough so that you could attack the treasure fleets, but far enough away to where it would be inconvenient for the Spanish to actually do something about them. Unfortunately, what we're going to find about Ribault is that he's a good navigator, but not a very good leader. He basically drops off 28 guys, tells them to build a fort, and then just pieces out. He says he'll be back in a few months with supplies. 28 people is not a lot to build a settlement. Plus, South Carolina summers are brutal. Plus, there wasn't a lot of food. Plus, the natives really started to hate them when they started stealing their corn. Plus, Ribault never came back. So after a while, these guys are like, forget this. They build a ship using whatever is laying around, and they try sailing back to France. across the Atlantic Ocean in an open ship without a compass. Here's what that journey looked like. They set out at sea on the first good wind. The calms and erratic gusts soon held them captive, and the fresh water and victuals gave out. They devoured their shoes, leather collars, straps, and dried animal skins. Others drank their own urine. They remained without food or drink for 3 days. Finally, it was suggested that it would be wiser that one die rather than all of them. The lot fell on the banished Larcher. He was killed, and his flesh was equally divided among them. Then they drank his warm blood. Yeah, it was really bad, and I think you see where this is going. But you're wrong. Most of them survived. They got close enough to England to where they were picked up by an English ship, and a bunch of them made it back to France. So this first attempt at a colony had failed. Part of it was Ribault's fault. I'm not sure why he would have missed something as basic as, hey, let's bring enough food so that if there isn't food just laying around, we will not starve to death. But he did. But the other reason it failed was because Ribault's timing was really bad. He arrived just as the French wars of religion were breaking out, and this was no time to be asking the French government for support for a far-off colony. He went over to England to try to get support, but was accused of being a spy and got locked up in the Tower of London. So yeah, that's why he wasn't able to get back and help. Despite the debacle of the first expedition, the French decided to try again. And this time they were a lot more serious. They recruited more colonists, including some women. You had a wide range of professions. You had mechanics, tailors, blacksmiths, barbers, physicians, even an astronomer. You had a wide range of motivation for these colonists. Some were Huguenots looking for a safe haven, some were glory hounds, and some were all about the gold. The leader was a man named René Goulon de Laudonnière. This guy was a legit nobleman from one of the best families in France. He had actually accompanied the first expedition, but was not one of the 28 guys left behind. Laudonnière decided to settle his colonists down in that area around Jacksonville that they had explored during the previous expedition. It had some virtues. It was easy to defend. It had access to the Atlantic Ocean, but it was a lot closer to the Spanish than the South Carolina location had been. When they arrived, the new colonists got to work. They built a fort, they built homes, they made contact with the natives, they even figured out how to turn the local grapes into wine. I mean, they are French. They called the new settlement La Caroline, but because it was basically just a fort, we call it Fort Caroline. Initially, things seemed to be going pretty well, but then some problems emerged. The main issue was food. Florida is not an easy place to grow food, and these colonists were by and large not farmers. It seems like Laudonnière was more prepared, supply-wise, for this expedition, but it was not long until the colonists' clothes were fitting a bit looser, like a lot looser. These people were not super well off back in France, but they were not used to starving to death under the hot summer sun. It didn't help that instead of farming, they were out trying to find gold, which there isn't any in Florida. Some of them got so fed up that they took one of the ships and started to raid the Spanish ships in the Caribbean. This didn't make the Spanish happy at all, but by and large, the experience at Fort Caroline was pretty miserable. And day after day, the colonists just kind of stared out at the horizon, praying that they would see a ship coming that would bring them food and a ticket home. After a year of living in pre-air conditioning Florida, the colonists started building a boat to try and sail back to France like their predecessors had. But then one day the colonists saw a bunch of ships approaching. It was our old friend Ribault. He was bringing them everything they needed. More people, food, tools, guns, and most importantly, hope. It must have been a joyous occasion for the desperate colonists. Their salvation was at hand. All thoughts of abandoning the colony faded away. This was August 28th, 1565. In the midst of their joy, they had no idea that their doom was upon them, for the Spanish were coming. Spanish spies had alerted King Philip II that the French were trying to settle Florida. Philip became even more enraged when he found out it wasn't just French people settling in Florida, it was French heretics. Some were even pirates. As far as he was concerned, French heretic pirates were the absolute worst. They had to be eliminated. The man he put in charge of eliminating the French was Pedro Menendez de Avilés. This guy was a fanatical Catholic who took his job very seriously. Menendez set out for Florida with a force that was slightly smaller than what the French had at their disposal. With the help of some natives, he learned the location of the French colony. Mere days after Ribault's arrival and all the hope that he brought, Menendez's force almost sunk the French ships sitting outside of the colony. The French escaped, but it was a close call. Menendez and his troops settled about 40 miles south of Fort Caroline and founded St. Augustine. So the Spanish were here, and they seemed pretty serious. Ribault, Laudonnière, and the other leaders needed to figure out what the heck to do. Spirits were high, the French were well equipped, and they did outnumber the Spanish. Ribault believed that this was the time to strike. He was going to lead the French forces down, strike the Spanish, and drive them away from Florida forever. Laudonnière strongly objected to this plan. He had been living in Florida for over a year. He knew that at this time of year, there were some nasty storms that would come by, and gee, that would really throw a wrench into things if one of those happened to strike while Ribault was executing his little maneuver. He figured that it would be better to sit in this nice fort that they have built and wait for the Spanish to come to them. Laudonnière was right, but Ribault was now in charge, so he won the argument. So Ribault and about 600 men sailed south. This included just about every able-bodied man in the colony. Laudonnière was left in command of the fort, and all he had at his disposal were the disabled and the sick. Ribault's forces arrived just outside of St. Augustine and appeared to take the Spanish by surprise. For a moment, Menendez thought, oh my goodness, this might be the end. Then, because it's Florida in September, a hurricane struck. Ribault's forces were blown away. Menendez went from having a panic attack to euphoria. He could not believe his luck. While he didn't know for sure, he figured that most of the colony's fighting men were probably on those ships. That meant that the fort was lightly defended. Now would be the perfect time to strike. Obviously, they couldn't sail there in the middle of a hurricane, but maybe they could march over land. Many of the Spanish objected. Are we really gonna march 40 miles over land through the swamps in the middle of a freaking hurricane? Even a small garrison at Fort Caroline could probably stop a ragtag group of tired, hungry Spaniards. Plus, they didn't know exactly where Fort Caroline was. They knew the general area, but they could be spending days wandering around through the swamps while a hurricane is barreling down on them. While they were doing that, Ribault's forces might regroup and seize St. Augustine. Then they would be stuck. Menendez's plan was a big risk. Given what they knew, it had a high chance of failure. And that failure might lead to France winning the battle for Florida. Menendez took these points in, said that they were good points, but that he was the boss and it was time to start marching. Menendez led 500 men north, through the swamps, in the middle of a hurricane. It took 4 days and was about as miserable as you would expect. 100 of them dropped out during the journey. Luckily for the Spanish, they did find Fort Caroline, and they found that it wasn't even defended by the B team or the C team. It was just not defended. Laudonnière did fear a Spanish attack, and he had taken what few able-bodied men he had and put them on guard duty, but there was just a general complacency at the fort. I mean, what kind of man would attack a fort in the middle of a hurricane? Pedro Menendez de Avilés was that kind of man. At dawn on September 20th, 400 half-starved, wet, tired Spaniards surged out of the woods and attacked the fort while the garrison slept. They breached the gate and started to kill everyone. Laudonnière leapt out of his tent. He was still wearing his night clothes. He saw that Spanish banners were flying on all four corners of the fort, and he decided to get out of there. In less than an hour, Menendez conquered the French colony in America. All the men who couldn't escape were slaughtered. The women and children were taken into captivity. It was a triumph for the Spanish. When Menendez returned to St. Augustine, he found out about what had happened to Ribault. Basically, they had shipwrecked in the south, had lost most of their weapons, and didn't really have any food. So Menendez led a small party down to finish the job. And here's how things went with Ribault. After they were all tied, he asked if they were Catholics or Lutherans, or if any of them desired to make confession. Jean Ribault replied that all who were there were of the new religion. Menendez then ordered all to be killed. He spared only the fifers, drummers, and trumpeters, and 4 others who said that they were Catholics. So Menendez executed hundreds of people. Ribault's beard and a piece of his skin was sent to King Philip, because that's not crazy. His head was cut into 4 parts and was raised on the corners of the fort at St. Augustine. The French presence in Florida was eliminated. After barely surviving for over a year, the colonists had appeared to have been saved by the arrival of Ribault. 1 month later, they were all either dead, in captivity, or wandering around the swamps. With 2 failed attempts under their belts, including a complete slaughter, the French abandoned their attempts at colonizing Florida. For the next 200 years, Florida would be Spanish. But the colony never thrived because, as we talked about earlier, it was a tough sell getting people to move there. That said, St. Augustine is still around and is the oldest continuous European settlement in the United States. If you enjoy these videos, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.